All right. I'm excited for this podcast episode to welcome Dana Caspersen. Dana, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. A pleasure to be here.
Now, Dana, from what I understand, you are a conflict engagement specialist. You're a
Hmm.
best-selling author. You've got two books. Your first book came out, I guess, 10 years ago, in
Hmm.
2015, called Changing the Conversation, 17 Principles of Conflict Resolution. And then you just released a brand new book in January called Conflict is an Opportunity, 20 Fundamental Decisions for Navigating Difficult Times, which I'm excited to talk to you about.
Yeah,
Uh,
thank you.
you're also a TEDx speaker, an award-winning performing artist, I believe ballet, right?
Dancer. Hmm.
Yeah. You've worked with individuals, organizations, communities worldwide as a trainer, coach, consultant, dialogue designer. I want to talk to you about that. I
Hmm.
don't know what that is, but that sounds interesting. Um, and um, and so you empower people and organizations to navigate complex and challenging situations. I'm excited to, find out more about you, your approach as a mediator, as a conflict resolution specialist. Being that, myself, I'm a mediator. I've been doing it for 18 years. I specialize in family conflicts.
Hmm.
So, you know, high energy, high
High
dynamics,
energy.
high
Yeah.
emotion.
Hmm.
But you've got years and years of experience, and I'm excited to, dig into about, the new book.
Hmm.
Conflict is an opportunity. A lot of times people look at conflict and they run from it instead of embracing it and figuring out what can I learn from this.
Hmm.
So, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, so my experience is the same as, and it was my initial personal experience too, to try to run from conflict or try to maneuver behind the scenes to kind of tamp things down. And eventually I realized, okay, this just makes things worse. And then conflict either simmers or explodes or it degrades our quality of life in so many ways, in so many areas. And so I started studying in conflict kind of out of self-defense. I'm like, there's just got to be a better way to be in my life. And then as I saw how things can really unfold differently when we approach conflict differently, I started studying, got a degree, and began working in the field with the real focus for me of how do people develop their own capacity to step into the challenges of conflict with some confidence, with some skill, with more ease, with less stress, with adaptability, and doing it not through particular tools or techniques, but through really building up your own internal mindset so that you're like, okay, whoo, this might be a little hard right now, but I'm going to take a step back. I'm going to say, all right, what might be possible here? Like you say, what don't I understand yet about this? What do we need to understand between us? What are we trying to figure out? And what might that make possible if we look at what's coming from both sides in terms of what people need, what they're interested in, what they're afraid of, what they're concerned about? If we see that all as information, kind of a map that says, okay, here's where constructive change might happen.
Yeah.
If we look at it instead of pushing it down or running away from it. Yeah.
Well, and a lot of times in mediation, especially when I'm dealing with a husband and a wife, or a mother and a father, and we're doing stuff, I say, a lot of times people approach conflict face to face. And that
Hmm.
can seem like me against you, combative. And I said, what you need to do is turn shoulder to shoulder. Now you're
Hmm.
unified to figure out what do we have in common, and then how do we break through and embrace what we're having to deal with. Like running from it, just like you said, running from it, it may rear its head later. It could be
Hmm.
bigger and worse, or it has already degraded the relationship, which makes it hard to work through it. And so just how you view it can really, change how you can work through it. And as a professional, how do you help people then change their mindset and embrace it? Like, what
Yeah.
techniques do you use to help people go, wait a second, I don't need to run from it. I can breathe, I can look at it from a different perspective, and then we can move together. What techniques or what do you talk about and use?
Mm. So, first of all, what you brought up there, I think, is really beautiful. This idea of moving shoulder to shoulder. And I think of that because I also do come from a dance background. I think of things choreographically. So, how are we shaping the environment that we're in? How are we shaping the configuration that we are in or that we understand ourselves to be in? So, like you say, there's an internal mindset all the time that also has kind of a choreographic aspect to it that thinks, okay, this is a standoff, or this is a fight, or I'm running from danger. And what it means to, first of all, give that a place till you can see it more clearly. And
Sure.
that's one of the things that I do. And sometimes I really use physicality to do that. Just like you said, you can either use it as a way to highlight and throw light on what it is that you're already thinking internally and how that's impacting what you're able to see as possible in your relationships and in your conversations and in the overall situation. And so sometimes I will, sometimes I'll literally ask people to walk side by side and have a conversation instead of sitting down at a table. Sometimes I will work with individuals to, first of all, get a better sense of what they're thinking for themselves. Like, oh, wow, yeah, I'm really thinking that I need to put this wall up and they're impossible. And I just need to win this situation and get out of it. And once you realize, okay, that's where my attention is right now. So one of my primary things I think about is where do we put our attention? Because that's the power that we have to shape our internal experience and also our impact on the world. So, are we getting really focused in on attack and defense? And are we just kind of circling around in that without ever letting our emotions, which I see as kind of flags that are being waved by what's needed, um, without letting our emotions guide us down to this level of like, okay, this is hard, but what really matters? What really matters to me? What do I know what really matters to the other person? And being able to ask the other person without attacking them to say, okay, obviously we have some different ideas going on here, but I really want to understand what matters to you.
Yeah.
What's the most important thing to you here? So training people to see attention as a movable power that we have, we can focus on um, instead on this level of what matters. We can focus on the decisions that are ours to make, how we're choosing to respond, what mindset we're building by what we practice every day.
So you said something that was interesting about, not even knowing what really you're even negotiating what is important to you. I
Mm,
just recently, so in September of 2024, I took a executive education course called Persuasion Without Authority at Columbia Business School
mm,
up in New York, and it was really interesting because what they did is in the first like 5 minutes of this course with I think it was 23 professionals from around the world that flew in for this. They split the class in half. They gave us a scenario to negotiate and sent us away, had us record it,
mm,
and then brought us back and said, okay, what was the point system? And it
mm-hmm,
was interesting because out of all of these professionals and what the professor was showing us was he said, look, here's why you guys are here, even though you're all high level, people in your
mm,
profession, but you have no idea how to negotiate. And he showed us based on the number system that there was only three groups that even knew what they were doing. But what was interesting was he said, look, you know what? Who can tell me what the top five things in order were priority of the person you were negotiating with?
mm-hmm.
And what was interesting, Dana, was hardly anybody could. He goes, I just sent you for 30 minutes to have a conversation with the other side, and none of you can tell me what was even important to them, and you're negotiating. He goes, you're not listening, you're not asking the right questions, you're not paying attention. And what
Mm,
that did was it opened up everyone's mind, put their guard down so that they could then learn what he wanted to teach for the remainder of the week. But it was interesting that we're negotiating. It's like, okay, what was motivating our counterpart that we're negotiating with?
Yeah.
Most people did not. There were three people in the entire class that actually knew, okay, this was priority number one, priority number two, priority number three. And so as a mediator, that's one of the things that I do at the beginning of a mediation is I'm like, okay, what are we here for?
Hmm.
Okay, what's most important to you? And then I ask them, okay, well, what are your biggest fears and hesitations?
Yeah.
Because if I know what's their goal and what's the pitfall they're trying to avoid,
Hmm.
as a conflict resolution specialist, as a mediator, I'm able to then help them navigate. Because if I don't even know, and sometimes they don't even know, you know,
Yeah.
I think sometimes we've got to draw it out of them, asking those open-ended questions and
Hmm.
exploratory questions, going, what do you want from this? I
Yeah.
just want it to be over. Okay,
What will that help
tell
with?
me, tell me what that looks like in your universe.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's absolutely, and that's what really interests me in terms of working with individuals as well, is how do individuals, if there's no mediator around to help them, how do
Right.
they develop their own capacity to say, okay, what is it that, what does matter to me here? And to be able to really develop a mindset of curiosity that helps you kind of step out of this sort of fortress of defense or some kind of attack modality, and a real curiosity that says, okay, I disagree with this person. I might not even like them, but I need their information to be able to understand how we're going to move forward in a way that works. Because a one sided, of course, strategy will probably fail pretty
Yeah.
quickly. And so, what does it mean to build up this mindset that says, what might be possible here? What is up? What's important to you? What matters? Yeah.
Well, and a lot of times, and I'm sure that, dealing with maybe organizations and whatnot, sometimes the conflict may be just a one-off. Like we've got a business deal, and you know what? We're not going to see them again. We're not going to deal with them again. But then
Yeah.
you've got the personal relationships where,
Hmm.
like, if I'm doing a divorce and they've got kids, they've got an ongoing daily interaction year after year that they really need those tools. So my question is, in your new book,
Mm.
20 fundamental decisions for navigating difficult times. Do you talk about the tools for the individual? Like,
Hmm.
are there is this a good resource for them to, if they don't have a mediator, if they don't have you, if they
Yeah.
don't have me, that
Yeah.
they can learn their own internal techniques to deal with that?
Yes, absolutely. So the book is based around these, is set up to be a guide to be with you, kind of a
So it's like a
friendly,
self-help guide.
kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
And I set it up in the way that I find is most helpful, which is what are the decisions that I'm already making in every conflict, and how is the way I'm approaching them impacting me, so that you make these decisions more visible and really start to make them consciously. So it's set up in these 20 short chapters. Each chapter has a practice section, so you can really integrate the ideas. And there's three sections. One is, what am I doing? So, what are all the things that I'm doing internally before I get involved with anybody? And then the second section is, what are we doing? So, what are the kind of patterns that are in place between us? What decisions are being made that are impacting our interactions? And then, what are the systems doing? Because we're always already being impacted by systems. So, what decisions are we making in relationship to existing systems? And it's a very functional book. So, you could either read through it from the beginning and just kind of work with the practice sections, build up your own capacity to be able to step into those challenges and think, okay, where am I? What am I doing? What would I like to do? What steps do I want to take next? And or you may be wanting to analyze a situation you're in or prepare for a difficult conflict, and then you can go through these 20 questions and say, okay, which one's resonating? I'm going to go to that chapter. I'm going to read that and help me out. So it's not like a big textbook that you have to slog through, but
Sure.
instead it's a very targeted, useful handbook to have on your on hand. And it might also be, some people say, if they're just finding themselves getting stressed out with something, they just pick it up and open to a page, because it's also set up in a way that there's a lot of space and around ideas, so that you can find an idea quickly that just kind of helps you ground yourself, get yourself back into the mindset you want to be in. Um, and and it's functional in the sense that this is not something you have to decide whether or not to do. You're already doing it.
Yeah.
So that we
Yeah.
notice, okay, I'm already in this, I'm already doing this practice. How is what I'm currently doing impacting me? Is it how I want to be in the world? And what decisions can I make differently that will actually help me move in my real goals? Because sometimes, like you say, if let's say some parents are in a big ongoing conflict, they can get into a zero-sum mentality, kind of a win-lose situation. But that's not their ultimate goal. It starts to seem like the goal,
Yeah.
but their goal is probably to have a good life, for their kid to be
Peace,
safe, peace, be able to go
rest.
on with themselves, rest.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so to take a step back and say, what are my decisions currently supporting or preventing? What do I want to support and prevent?
Yeah.
And then to make those decisions consciously.
So back in 2019, it's interesting. In 2019, I took an executive education program at Harvard Law School, and they had given us a tool that I have used ever since, similar to that in a mediation setting where when and you had mentioned before, like when things seem to start going in a circle, I call
Mm.
it, all right, we're circling the wagons, we're repeating ourselves, we're going
Hmm.
nowhere, we're getting stuck in the mud,
Yeah.
you know. And usually I know that that's when like everything has been said. There's like now they're just seeming they seem blocked.
Hmm.
So that's when then I break out a tool and I hand them a sheet and I said, okay, now don't let the other person see your answers, but I need you to fill this out. So we sort of just put pause on the whole conversation.
Hmm.
And on the sheet, it says, what are the top 5 reasons why it's better to settle than to go to court and let a judge decide? On the other side, why is it better to go to the judge decide than to settle? And it says, what will I gain by settling rather than going to court? And then what will I
Mm.
gain by going to court rather than settling? And I
Yeah.
say, okay, now fill this out. Now, don't show the other person what you're doing. Keep your answers private. So they're like sneaky filling it out and whatnot. But what's interesting, one of the things that they had taught us was as soon as hand goes to paper, emotions cannot exist. The brain kicks in.
Mm. Hmm.
And all of a sudden, whatever emotion we were dealing with in the room, it's like it just gets sucked out. It's the coolest thing to feel and watch because all of a
Yeah.
sudden, all that tension, that clouded emotion gets sucked out. And what I tell people often in a negotiation is I said, look, think of yourself like a 4 burner stove. You are emotional. If I was to say, take your emotion out of this, Dana, well, okay, now you're either a sociopath or you're gonna be a serial killer. Like, no, you're an emotional human being.
Yeah.
But you can't let your most important decisions be run by your emotions because today it's here, tomorrow it's here. I said,
Hmm.
so what we need to do is we need to simply not take your emotions off the stove, put it on the back burner, and let's be front burner thinkers. Let's put logic and reason and let's talk about things. Yes, we are still emotional, but we can't let the emotions drive this. So what's interesting is when they start jotting down their answers, all of a sudden the emotion subsides. They're still emotional, but it lets the brain kick in and be like, okay, what are the pros and cons and what does this really look like? When they're done, I said, okay, give me your papers. I said, all right, now we're going to exchange them. And they're
Hmm.
like, and of course they're like, well, I thought it was secret. I said it was, but I didn't say it was going to stay secret. So now I say, okay, exchange. And then I have each of them read out loud what the other
Mm.
person said. And Dana, what's interesting is a lot of times they're in the same headspace.
Hmm.
And that's where then then they can see without the emotion clouding it. They're able to start to look towards that goal and go instead of face to face, shoulder to shoulder, because they see, wait a second, we both think that the same outcome is better figuring this out rather than going to a judge. And
Yeah.
it was such a great tool. And I have not had the opportunity. I want to move into to this. I've not had the opportunity to really deal with businesses like that or in a corporate setting. I can imagine it would work the same way.
Hmm.
Probably not as emotional, or maybe. I mean, I've heard stories of unions and they, they can get pretty emotional.
Yeah.
Um, But it was a great tool to really, like you said, like, okay, well, let's figure out what are the goals. Do we have the
Yeah.
same goals? Do we not have the same goals? How do we achieve those goals? And a lot of times I find that as people are trying to move forward, there can be, I mean, I'm sure as helping people resolve conflict, we are very creative. We could find 20 different ways to get to the same end goal. They're going
Hmm.
to argue all day long about which of the 20 is better instead of, okay, look, here's the end goal. Who cares how we get there? How do you want to get there?
Yeah.
And sometimes reverse engineering it actually helps better because otherwise we just argue all day on the method of reaching the end goal.
Exactly. I love that because I see what you're doing there is something I think about a lot when I'm working, training people or working in groups is what is the question between us? So previously in your scenario there, that the question had been, whose strategies are going to be the best ones and who's going to win them. But you introduced a different question, a common question that contained them both. And then through having them read it, you really made it clear that both people's experience was in that in relationship to this question.
Yeah.
And I find it's the same thing in business or in educational settings is that oftentimes the question that people feel like they're holding between them is an adversarial one. And when you take the time to step it back and say, okay, so if we look first of all at where that adversarial question is going to take us, I think of this Buddhist phrase that says revulsion is the foot of meditation, meaning people have to get sick enough of something to be able to put in the work to change.
That
And
is true.
so oftentimes, and it has to be like kind of like you said, what's going to happen if I really go hard on this adversarial thing? Okay, we're probably going to end up with this ongoing whatever. Make a scenario so they feel, because the emotion is part of it too, that they can feel like
Sure.
how awful that's going to be. If we continue like this for the next 20 years, oh my God, life's going to just suck. This is terrible.
Yeah.
And so to have that, okay, so that's what would happen with that. So the common question, for example, that you introduced there was, what do our current options offer us, and how do they connect to what our real goals are on a deeper level? And then people had that between them, and they're commonly working on it. And I find it's the same thing in any organization, is that people very quickly get into strategic argument. Like you say, they could go all day, they could go for years. But once the common question gets introduced, and there might be several questions that need to happen in advance of that before we can understand what that question is, and all those informations you had them write down help us then ultimately shape a new question that is the common question for going forward.
So whether you're coaching individuals or dealing with groups or organizations,
Hmm.
what tips do you have for like to help people like remain calm, cool, collective, like in stressful situations or in negotiations?
Yeah. So there's some somatic things that help, some body-based things that can help. One is that one of the most powerful things is breathing. So
Right.
when you inhale, make your exhales longer so that you get your nervous system kind of down regulated. You can always do that no matter where you are. Sometimes, if you find yourself really escalating out in a way that you don't want to, it can be helpful to think about a person or even an object that kind of personifies the type of energy you'd like to be engaged with. Imagine them next to you, lending you that energy so that you
Okay.
let your body physically help you calm down. And another little practice that I do with people is a lot of times it helps to work on this stuff in advance, because when you're in the middle of a conflict, it's too late to practice what you want to do.
Yeah.
So a lot of what this book is about is how do I practice in advance so that I am more likely to be able to be in the mindset I want. So a little practice might be,
Preventative maintenance. Like
yeah,
like get ready, do your prep work before you get to the negotiation table.
yeah,
Preventative maintenance so you're not sitting there and then doing damage control.
exactly. And to notice that you're already doing practice. And what is the practice that you're already doing? How is that? What's that supporting? So, like a little practice I do sometimes with people is say, okay, imagine yourself in a super defensive mode. You're angry, you're defensive, just really get into it physically, how it feels, and sit how you might sit. And so I have people just feel how that feels to tighten down and get how narrow your mind, getting your body gets tight. And then shake that off and say, okay, if you were feeling really open and like curious about this person and willing to talk, how do you feel physically? And people tend to notice an opening and a kind of an uprightness and an opening of what they can see. And then I ask them to go back and forth physically between those things. So they start to notice that that is changeable. We have
Yeah.
a lot of impact on our own attitude and mindset so that you can get used to, okay, I can actually access that. Even when I'm stressed out, I might habitually go into this other mode, but I can direct my attention, again, back to attention, to say, okay, how do I want to be? All right, let me just take a step back here. I want to get into this curious mindset. Okay, what don't I know yet?
Yeah.
What do I want to ask this person? What do I need to find out? And then one really super valuable tool is to get used to making requests, and requests versus demands. So if you make a demand, which is often what people do in a conflict, then
Sure.
you're leaving the person just with two. You're creating, again, back to this kind of choreographic thing. You make a demand, you've created a scenario where a person only has two choices. They can
Yes.
comply to the, yeah, they can comply to your thing, or they can defy you.
Right.
And both of those promote resentment and anger and
Right.
simmering. But if
Well,
you
it
make
goes
a
back to what you were
request,
saying. It creates that win-lose scenario instead of a
yeah,
win-win. Because if I comply, I've
you
lost. If
lost.
I deny, I'm trying to win. But do you really win long
Right.
term?
Nobody's won. Yeah. And the
Yeah.
difference I see is that when, and this is something I work with a lot when I in trainings, is developing a request, because a request is something that is coming from what matters. So you start from what matters to you,
Right.
and you might find out what the other person's thinking, what they're concerned about, what you're concerned about, and then to make a doable request in relationship to, like, okay, it sounds like, we're both having concerns around this. Sounds like this is important to you, and I'm really caring about this. Here's some things I'm wondering, would you be willing to do blah blah blah? And it might be something simple like, would you be willing to sit down and talk about how we want to structure the kids' sleeping schedule, for example?
Right.
Um, and a request, it's a real request if it's okay if the person says no,
Right.
because you stay connected to what matters to you. And that's just kind of an information gathering thing. They say, no. Oh, okay. So is it because of this? So then you can start to unpack these things. And it places, again, this question between you to figure out, so that the two of you are working on something, even if you're in disagreement, as opposed to um, being in reaction to a demand, which already spins off into a secondary conflict.
Yeah. So, so as you're using a request as a valuable tool,
Hmm.
probing and sometimes I find that even with that, you can use it as a tool because you may find out that something's important to someone else and it isn't to you, but you could trade it for something that's important to you. I mean, just being
Hmm.
able to have that conversation and explore instead of just going yes or no, demand yes or no.
Yeah.
What if, what if you just have that person on the other side that is just no, 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 like everything is just difficult, no.
Yeah.
And they sort of just like they're there to negotiate, but they're not there to negotiate because it's their way or the highway and they're not going to move. Okay, then what?
Yeah. So, first of all, I think that it can be really useful to put a question between you, like, okay, it sounds like you really don't want to, all the stuff I'm suggesting doesn't make sense to you. What does make sense to you? So then they'll come at you with a bunch of strategies. Then you can say, oh, okay, so that sounds like it makes sense. What will that help with? So that
Yeah,
you help them, even though they're coming
plot
at you
out.
strategy. Yeah, you help them name more clearly what it is that they care about, because of course everybody gets into conflict because they care about something.
Yeah,
Nobody's there because they don't care.
sure.
So even the person who's like, no, we have to do it my way and shut up and whatever, they care about something. And if you
Yeah,
can figure that out, you're much more likely to be able to say, okay, so it sounds like this really matters to you. And oftentimes that acknowledgement, as of course is one of the primary things that helps get conversations going, because we usually skip over acknowledgement. We're like, I don't need to, that'll just be supporting them. But to say, it sounds like, okay, it sounds like for you, autonomy is really important. You really want to
yeah,
be able to make your own decisions. And then that they can be like, yeah. So then that's your first yeah.
yeah.
And then you say, okay. And it sounds like in the situation now, that's not happening and you're feeling kind of stuck. Is that it?
Yeah.
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 And then you can start to unfold, okay, and figure out what it is that what would be the components of a situation that would work for both of you to make sure you're trying to figure that out. And then of course, if there's someone who's really not there in good faith and it doesn't want to have a conversation, then you come back to the question, okay, what is my decision to make in relationship to that?
Sure.
Instead of trying to jam through something that's not your decision to make. A lot of times we get stuck wasting our energies there. So to keep checking back, what's my decision to make in this current situation? What are my goals? Are the decisions I'm making in connection to those goals?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and for me doing divorce, it's like, okay, if you're not going to figure this out, a judge will figure it out. And
Yeah.
so so sometimes when I'm dealing with a difficult person like that, I'm like, look, today is your opportunity to have input and a say in the outcome. Now,
Hmm.
you can choose not to, and then you'll go to court and you'll lose all decision-making authority. That's still a choice.
Yeah.
It's still a choice. So if you don't want to have a choice and input and a say, that's a choice, and then somebody will make it for you. And that sometimes then breaks through that because it's
Hmm.
like, they may just be there. And again, a lot of times it's emotional that they're just saying no. I remember, Dana, it was, they always say you never forget your first. I have never forgotten the first family divorce mediation I
Mm.
ever observed. When I was doing my certification, I had to do an observation. So I was co-mediating with the director of mediation in a judicial circuit, and it was a military divorce. And and it was interesting because I was there as the observer, co-mediator, but for the most part, I was quiet, watching and observing how this was going down. So the mediator was a woman. Of course, the wife, a woman. Her attorney was a woman. And then the husband was pro se, had no attorney, and then I was sitting there observing. And the attorney was appearing on the phone via his battleship that was getting ready to be deployed over to the Middle East. And so it was a very interesting dynamic because it was just a constant barrage of no's.
Mm.
And anything that the mediator said, it was met with a no.
Mm.
Anything that his wife said was met with a no. Anything that her attorney said was met with a no. So this was going on and it was sort of just getting to the stalemate.
Hmm.
And I remember the mediator observed, or the mediator looked at me like across the table, like, you want to try something? And so the first thing that popped into my head was I said to him, I said, hey, this is Matthew Brickman. He's like, okay. I said, okay, so what I hear is you're not going to do this. You do not want to do this. This is non-negotiable. You're
Mm.
absolutely opposed to this. Am I hearing this right? Yes. I said, well, look at that, everybody. We finally have a yes on the table. And so then I
Yeah.
said, okay,